The chandeliers of Alverstone House did not so much illuminate the ballroom as they dripped light, a thick golden honey that gilded the shoulders of women and the ambitions of men. It was the first ball of the season, hosted by the Duke of Alverstone himself, a man whose gravity was a force around which the entire county orbited. And in a quiet alcove, behind a potted palm that had seen better days, Miss Eleonora Ainsworth was discovering the particular physics of social invisibility. It was not a sudden state, but a gradual cooling, a slow retreat of attention until one was left perfectly still and perfectly alone, an object in a room full of people. She did not mind, or rather she had taught herself not to mind. Her dress, a simple gray silk that had been her mother's, was impeccably clean, but possessed none of the fashionable flounces and furbelows that bloomed around her. She was a guest by sufferance, the poor relation, the orphaned ward of a grudging uncle whose own estate, Ainsworth Park, was a study in genteel decay. To be here at all was a matter of obligation, a box ticked on the Duke's list of neighborly duties. She expected nothing more. And then she heard it. A voice, clear and carrying as a silver bell, belonged to Lady Beatrice Croft, a woman whose beauty was so universally acknowledged it had become a kind of fact, like the rising of the sun. "Look there, Your Grace," Lady Beatrice said, her tone a careful confection of amusement and charity. Eleonora did not need to see. She could feel the conversation turning towards her alcove like a tide. "Poor Miss Ainsworth. She has been rooted to that spot all evening. One would think she was part of the horticulture." A low murmur. The Duke's voice, deep and resonant. Eleonora could not make out the words, only the weary timbre. "Oh, but you must," Lady Beatrice insisted, her voice sharpening with the pleasure of her own magnanimity. "It is your duty as host. A pity dance. Think how it will make her night. She will have something to tell her grandchildren, should she ever acquire any." There was a pause, a silence that felt heavier than the Duke's previous words. In it, Eleonora felt herself being weighed and found wanting. She was not a woman to be desired or engaged, but a chore to be undertaken. The rustle of silk that followed was the sound of her own humiliation being set in motion. She kept her eyes fixed on the scuffed toe of her satin slipper, a tiny, worn continent on the vast, polished sea of the ballroom floor. She prayed he would not come, that he would find some ducal excuse, some pressing matter of state. But the Duke of Alverstone was a man of principle, and his principles, it seemed, extended to the charitable distribution of dances. Polished boots came to a halt before her. "Miss Ainsworth," he said. The name sounded foreign in his mouth, an unfamiliar assembly of syllables. She had to look up. He was taller than she had imagined, his presence a solid, unmovable column of dark wool and starched linen. His face was all severe angles and shadows, his eyes a cool, distant gray, like a winter sky. There was no warmth in them, only a kind of resigned correctness. He was doing his duty. "Your Grace," she murmured, her voice a thread of sound. "I find myself with a space on my card," he said, which they both knew to be a lie of exquisite politeness. "Would you do me the honor?" The honor. The word was a small, sharp stone in her throat. The honor was to be his project, his act of public kindness. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to say, "No, thank you, Your Grace. I am quite content communing with the palm." But to refuse a duke was to create a scene, and her entire existence was predicated on the avoidance of scenes. It would be an act of social defiance she could not afford. So she placed her gloved hand in his, feeling the brief, impersonal pressure of his fingers. He led her onto the floor. The other dancers parted for them, a subtle, rippling acknowledgement of his rank. She could feel Lady Beatrice's eyes on her back, could almost hear the satisfied little hum of a benevolent queen observing her decree. The orchestra struck up a waltz. The Duke put a hand on her waist, and it was a gesture of pure mechanics. There was a precise, calculated distance between their bodies. They began to move. He was an expert dancer, guiding her through the steps with an effortless authority that required nothing of her but compliance. For the first full turn around the room, he said nothing. He simply looked out over her head, his expression impassive, his jaw set. He was enduring this, and he was making sure she knew it. Then, as if remembering another of his duties, polite conversation, he spoke. His gaze dropped to her face, but it was a cursory, unfocused glance. "I trust you are enjoying the evening, Miss Ainsworth." "The music is quite lovely, Your Grace," she replied. It was a safe, neutral answer, the answer of a ghost. "My mother was fond of this particular composer," he said, his voice retaining its flat, uninterested tone. "She believed him to be a master of the form." "He is," Eleonora said, and for a moment she forgot to be a ghost. "His use of contrapuntal melodies in the second movement is revolutionary. He weaves them together without sacrificing the emotional core of the piece. It is a work of mathematics as much as art." There was a flicker of something in his cool gray eyes. Surprise. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but she had seen it. He had expected a simpering affirmative, not a technical analysis. He did not reply. The silence returned, more noticeable now that it had been broken by something other than platitudes. He seemed to be reassessing her, his gaze now fixed on her face with a disconcerting stillness. She felt a flush creep up her neck. She had said too much. She had revealed a thought, an opinion. She had, for a moment, been a person. The music swelled to its conclusion. He held her for the final, formal beat, then released her. The dance had lasted perhaps 4 minutes. It had felt like a lifetime. He escorted her from the floor, not back to her palm-shrouded alcove, but to a vacant chair along the wall. It was a marginal improvement. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Ainsworth," he said, the formulaic words delivered with the same air of finality as a judge passing sentence. He gave a short, correct bow and turned away without a backward glance. He walked directly back to Lady Beatrice, who rewarded him with a brilliant smile. Eleonora sat on the little gilt chair, her hands folded in her lap. She watched him, the powerful, severe Duke, reclaim his place at the center of the universe. She watched as Lady Beatrice laid a proprietary hand on his arm. She watched as the world realigned itself, leaving her once more on the forgotten periphery. She did not cry. Crying was a luxury for those who expected better. She had learned, through the long, difficult education of her father's decline and death, to expect nothing. But a decision was forming within her, cold and clear as ice. It was not a decision born of anger or pique, but of a profound, weary certainty. She would not be an object of pity. She would not be a charitable project. She would not be the girl he danced with once because he was told to. She did not yet know how, but she knew, with the same certainty that she knew the structure of a waltz, that she would find a way to be something other than invisible. Her worth would not be determined in a ballroom. Back in the small, chilly guest room at Alverstone House, Eleonora did not undress. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and stared at her own reflection in the dim, warped glass of the washstand mirror. The woman who stared back was pale and serious, her dark hair pulled back in a severe knot, her gray eyes shadowed with fatigue. The pity dress, as she now thought of it, seemed to hang on her like a shroud. She had felt its inadequacy all night, but now she felt it as an indictment. It was the uniform of her dependency, the plain gray flag of her diminished circumstances. Her father, a brilliant classicist with a mind like a sunlit library, had been utterly incapable of managing the practical world. He had loved books more than bread, and ancient Greek verbs more than balanced accounts. Eleonora had loved him for it, even as she had been the one to negotiate with creditors, to stretch a shilling into a pound, to watch their small inheritance dwindle to dust under the weight of his scholarly passions. In the final years of his illness, she had become the de facto master of their small, debt-ridden household. It was she who had learned to read a ledger, to argue with a supplier, to understand the brutal arithmetic of survival. She had hated it, and she had been good at it. It was a secret, shameful competence, a skill unbefitting a lady, learned in the shadows of her father's magnificent, impractical mind. When he died, leaving her with nothing but a mountain of debts and a letter of introduction to her mother's brother, Sir William Ainsworth, she had packed that competence away with her grief. At Ainsworth Park, she was expected to be decorative and silent, a testament to her uncle's grudging charity. Her aunt treated her with a kind of fretful condescension, forever remarking on her pallor and her unfortunate lack of a dowry. Her uncle largely ignored her, his thoughts consumed by the ever-worsening state of his own finances. Now, in the cold silence of the Duke's guest room, Eleonora felt that buried competence stir. It was the only thing she truly owned. The Duke and his world had judged her on what she appeared to be, a poor, plain, pitiable girl. They had not seen the mind that could calculate crop yields in her head, or the spirit that had held a crumbling household together for 5 years. They saw the gray dress, not the woman inside it. A cold resolve settled over her. Pity was a currency she would no longer accept. She would trade in a different coin. She rose and walked to the small writing desk. By the light of a single candle, she pulled out a sheet of paper. She would not write a bitter diary entry or a letter of complaint. She began to make a list. On one side, she wrote, assets, a quick mind, fluency in figures, an understanding of estate management, a willingness to work. On the other side, liabilities, no dowry, no connections, a dependent status, a name associated with debt. The liability column was formidable, but for the first time, looking at the asset column, she did not feel helpless. Her father had taught her to translate ancient texts, to find the hidden meaning in a forgotten language. These skills, she realized, were not so different. A ledger was a text. An estate was a complex sentence to be parsed and understood. She would translate her circumstances. The next morning, she sought an audience with her uncle. Sir William was in his study, a room that smelled of stale cigar smoke and quiet desperation. He was staring at a pile of bills with the expression of a man facing a firing squad. "Uncle," Eleonora began, her voice steady. He grunted without looking up. "If you've come to thank me for the opportunity to be snubbed by the entire county, you may spare your breath." "I have a proposal," she said, ignoring his bitterness. She walked to his desk and stood before him, not as a supplicant, but as an applicant. "I am aware the estate is not thriving." He finally looked up, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. And what would you know of it? I know what I see, she said quietly. Fields lying fallow that could be planted with clover to restore the soil. I know the tenants complain the steward is slow to approve repairs, and that the home farm's accounts have not been properly reconciled in years. I know that you are paying far too much for feed because no one has negotiated a better rate with the supplier in 10 years. Sir William stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. You have been spying. I have been observing, she corrected him gently. My father, for all his brilliance, was not a practical man. I learned to manage his affairs. I understand accounts. He let out a short, harsh laugh. You, a girl? You think you can do what a trained steward cannot? I think Mr. Henderson is either incompetent or dishonest, and I believe I can prove it if you will allow me access to the estate ledgers, she said, her voice unwavering. Give me 1 month. Let me review the books in the evenings. I will not interfere with Mr. Henderson's duties. If I find nothing, I will never speak of it again. But if I am right, I can help you. He was silent for a long time, studying her face. He saw not the niece he had resented, but a woman with a strange, unnerving seriousness in her eyes. He was a desperate man, and desperation makes one consider the unorthodox. He was bleeding money. What harm could it do to let the girl look at a few books? At worst, it would keep her occupied. 1 month, he said, his voice grudging. The ledgers are in the estate office. Do not make a nuisance of yourself. I will not, Eleanora promised. That evening, after the household had settled into the quiet rhythms of the night, Eleanora made her way to the small, dusty estate office at the back of the house. The room was cold, smelling of damp paper and mice. A single oil lamp cast a pool of wavering light onto a large wooden desk, which was piled high with leather-bound ledgers. This, she thought, was her ballroom. These were her partners. She opened the first book. The handwriting was a careless scrawl, the columns of figures smudged and chaotic. But to Eleanora, it was a language she understood. She began to read. She was no longer Miss Ainsworth, the wallflower. She was an archaeologist of finance, digging through layers of neglect and obfuscation, searching for the truth. And as her fingers traced the lines of ink, a strange sense of peace settled over her. Here, in this cold, forgotten room, she was not invisible. She was powerful. The weeks that followed settled into a new and secret rhythm. By day, Eleanora was the same quiet, unobtrusive niece, performing the small, tedious tasks her aunt assigned her, arranging flowers, mending linens, writing polite letters. She endured her aunt's sighs about her unmarried state and her uncle's continued irascibility. She was a model of feminine docility, a creature of the drawing room and the garden. But by night, she lived a second life. As soon as the great house fell silent, she would slip away to the estate office. The ledgers, which had at first seemed a chaotic jumble, began to yield their secrets to her patient scrutiny. She did not merely read them, she inhabited them. She created her own parallel set of books on fresh paper, her handwriting neat and precise, a stark contrast to the steward's scrawl. She cross-referenced invoices with delivery records, tallied columns that had not been summed in years, and began to map the flow of money in and out of Ainsworth Park. It was, as she had suspected, a story of mismanagement on a grand scale. Mr. Henderson, the steward, was not so much a thief as he was a creature of profound and bone-deep indolence. He paid whatever price was asked, approved repairs without inspection, and allowed tenants to fall months and then years into arrears without consequence. He was bleeding the estate dry through 1,000 tiny cuts of sheer neglect. She found invoices for tools that were never delivered, payments for phantom bushels of seed, and a steady, inexplicable trickle of funds to a cousin who apparently supplied the stables with a truly astonishing quantity of hay. Her work was methodical, almost monastic. She felt no righteous fury, only a kind of cool, intellectual satisfaction in untangling the must. This was a puzzle, and she was good at puzzles. Her loyal maid, Agnes, a woman of few words and fierce loyalty, was her only confidant. She would bring Eleonora a cup of hot tea in the dead of night, her presence a silent testament of support. "You'll catch your death in this draughty place, miss," Agnes would murmur, placing the cup by her elbow. "It is better than the drawing-room, Agnes," Eleonora would reply, not looking up from her figures. "Here, things add up." Agnes would nod, understanding completely. She had seen her mistress's spirit dim in the polite suffocation of the main house. Here, under the flickering lamplight, with ink staining her fingers, Miss Eleonora seemed more herself than she had in years. At the end of the month, Eleonora presented her findings to her uncle. She did not bring him a flurry of accusations. She brought him a single, slender ledger of her own making. On the left-hand page of each opening, she had copied a page from Mr. Henderson's books. On the right, she had written her corrected and annotated version, with neat footnotes explaining each discrepancy. It was an argument made not with passion, but with irrefutable arithmetic. Sir William sat at his desk for 2 hours, turning the pages in stunned silence. The cigar went out in his hand. He saw, in her elegant, precise script, the story of his own ruin, and the clear, well-lit path out of it. He saw years of waste, of casual pilfering, of sheer, breathtaking incompetence. And he saw that his quiet, overlooked niece possessed a mind sharper than any man he had ever employed. When he finally looked up, the suspicion in his eyes had been replaced by a dawning, grudging respect. "My God, girl," he breathed, "you are your father's daughter after all. All his brains, but with sense." He did not apologize for his previous dismissal of her. He was not a man given to apologies. But he did something more significant. He slid her ledger across the desk. "What do you propose we do?" he asked. It was the first time he had ever asked for her opinion on anything. And so, the quiet revolution began. Mr. Henderson was dismissed, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a generous severance and a letter of recommendation so bland it was its own condemnation. He left in a state of bewildered indignation. Eleonora did not take his title. That would have been a scandal. But she became the quiet power behind the throne. Her uncle, humbled and newly focused, became her public face. He would meet with tenants and suppliers, armed with the notes and figures she had prepared for him. She suggested planting the fallow fields with turnips and clover, a new technique that would enrich the soil while providing winter feed for the livestock. She renegotiated every contract, her knowledge of their previous overpayments a powerful tool. She devised a system for rent collection that was both firm and fair, allowing tenants to pay in kind or labor if cash was short. She was not merely saving money. She was restoring the health of the estate, mending the frayed bonds between the great house and the people who depended on it. Months passed, turning into a year. The scent of decay at Ainsworth Park was slowly replaced by the smell of fresh paint, of mended roofs, of turned earth. The change was not dramatic, but it was steady. A quiet current of solvency and order began to flow through the veins of the estate. Eleonora, meanwhile, remained in the background. To the county, she was still just the poor relation, but to the tenants of Ainsworth Park, she was becoming something else entirely. They spoke of her in low, respectful tones. They called her the mistress's thinking cap. She found a kind of peace in her work. Her world was the estate office, the home farm, the tenant cottages. It was a world of tangible things: soil, grain, wood, and stone. And numbers, honest, unforgiving numbers that could not lie or flatter or pity. She had no need for ballrooms. She had built her own kingdom, a small, solvent queendom of ledgers and lists. She had made herself necessary. And in doing so, she had almost forgotten the man who had set her on this path. The Duke, with the cold gray eyes and the careless, wounding charity. Almost. The Duke of Alverston had not thought of Miss Eleonora Ainsworth in over a year. The pity dance had faded from his memory, a minor social obligation fulfilled and forgotten. His life was a structure of immense and overlapping responsibilities, managing his vast estates, sitting in the House of Lords, and navigating the relentless social season that seemed determined to marry him off to the most suitable bidder. Lady Beatrice Croft remained the frontrunner, a woman whose beauty was matched only by the scale of her father's landholdings. It was, by all accounts, a perfect match, a union of power and property. Yet a strange disquiet had taken root in the Duke. His world, so perfectly ordered, felt hollow. His conversations with Lady Beatrice were a tiresome dance of flattery and insinuation. She spoke of London gossip, of court fashions, of the latest scandal, but her eyes were always calculating the value of his title, his homes, his name. He felt like a prize bull being appraised at market. He had built his life around principles of logic and control, a reaction against his late father's ruinous sentimentality. But he was beginning to suspect that his principles had become a fortress, and he was a prisoner within it. It was business that brought him back into Eleonora's orbit. He wished to purchase a tract of woodland that bordered his own property, a piece of land belonging to the perennially hard-up Sir William Ainsworth. A year ago, the negotiation would have been a simple matter of naming his price to a desperate seller. He instructed his man of business, a sharp London solicitor named Mr. Dryden, to make the initial overtures. Dryden returned from his meeting at Ainsworth Park with a look of profound confusion. "It is a very strange situation, Your Grace," he reported, settling into a chair in the Duke's library. "I expected to deal with a fool or a bankrupt. Sir William is neither." The Duke raised an eyebrow. "Sir William Ainsworth. The man is famous for his debts." "Was, Your Grace, not is," Dryden corrected. "The estate is tidy, remarkably so. The tenants are paid up. The home farm is turning a profit. When I made your offer for the woodlands, Sir William did not leap at it. He produced a detailed projection of its value over the next 20 years, accounting for timber growth, coppicing rotations, and potential income from game licenses. He countered with a price 30% higher than your own, and frankly, Your Grace, his reasoning was impeccable." Alaric stared at him. This did not compute. Sir William Ainsworth was a bluff, indolent country baronet, not a shrewd financial strategist. "Did he have his steward with him?" "No, he was alone, but he kept referring to a set of notes. The handwriting on them was, well, it was very fine, almost feminine." Dryden shrugged. "Perhaps he has hired a new man, a very clever one." The Duke was intrigued. He was a man who appreciated competence above all else. The story of a failing estate turned solvent was a narrative that appealed to his deepest instincts. A few weeks later, on his way back from a visit to a neighboring landowner, he decided to call on Sir William himself, unannounced. He found Ainsworth Park transformed. The drive was neatly raked, the fences mended. The house itself, which had looked weary and down at heel, now had a coat of fresh paint on its windowsills. It was not grand, but it was respectable. It was solvent. Sir William, flustered but proud, received him in the study. The room no longer smelled of desperation. The Duke, making polite conversation, complimented him on the turnaround. "You have a fine steward, Sir William. My man Dryden was most impressed." Sir William flushed with pleasure and pride. "Ah, yes, my new methods. Takes a firm hand, you know. A head for figures." He puffed out his chest, the picture of a country squire who had single-handedly wrestled his fortune back from the brink. As they spoke, the door opened a crack. A young woman in a simple brown dress slipped in, placed a sheaf of papers on a side table, and turned to leave, all without a sound. But the Duke saw her. It was the girl from the ball. The pity dance. Miss Ainsworth. Her face was as serious and pale as he remembered, but there was a new quality to her stillness. It was not the stillness of a wallflower, but the quiet concentration of a person engaged in serious work. He watched as her uncle's eyes flickered to the papers she had left, a quick, automatic gesture of reliance. "Miss Ainsworth," the Duke said, his voice stopping her at the door. She turned. Her eyes, a deep, thoughtful gray, met his. There was no flicker of recognition, no girlish blush. She simply looked at him, waiting. "Your Grace," she said, her voice cool and level. "We met last year," he said, feeling an uncharacteristic need to explain himself. "At your ball," she confirmed. It was a statement of fact, not a cherished memory. She inclined her head politely and slipped out of the room, closing the door softly behind her. The Duke stood there, a strange feeling prickling at him. The fine, feminine handwriting on the notes. The girl who had appeared and disappeared like a ghost, leaving behind a vital piece of information for her uncle. The quiet, unnerving competence he had sensed in her brief analysis of the waltz a year ago. A suspicion, absurd and yet insistent, began to form in his mind. He concluded his business with Sir William, agreeing to the higher price for the woodland because, as his solicitor had noted, the valuation was sound. As he rode away from Ainsworth Park, he could not shake the image of the girl in the brown dress. He had dismissed her as a piece of decorative, pitiable fluff. But the tidy estate, the shrewd negotiations, the sheaf of papers left on the table, they told a different story. He had the distinct and unsettling feeling that he had negotiated with the wrong person. He had been speaking to the ventriloquist's dummy, while the ventriloquist herself had been standing quietly in the wings. The Duke of Alverstone did not like being wrong, and he was beginning to suspect that about Miss Eleonora Ainsworth, he had been wrong on a scale that was entirely new to him. The Duke's suspicion became a quiet obsession. He was a man who solved puzzles, and Miss Ainsworth had become the most compelling puzzle he had encountered in years. He began to make inquiries, not in the gossip-fueled drawing rooms of London, but in the more reliable networks of the countryside. He spoke to his own tenants who bordered the Ainsworth lands. He had a quiet word with the vicar. He even dispatched Mr. Dryden to the nearest market town to have a pint at the local inn and listen. The pieces came together slowly,
forming a picture that was the precise opposite of the one he had held. He learned of the dismissal of the old steward, Henderson. He heard whispers of the thinking cap at the great house, the quiet mistress who had learned the land as if it were a book. Tenants spoke of her with a reverence they had never afforded Sir William. They said she knew every field by name, that she had walked the length of every drainage ditch, that she had devised the new crop rotations herself. They said she was fair, but that her mind was like an iron trap when it came to figures. One man, a local solicitor by the name of Davies, was particularly forthcoming. He was a pleasant, earnest young man who handled some of Ainsworth Park's legal affairs.
"Miss Ainsworth," he'd said, when the Duke had casually brought her up. "A remarkable woman. The finest mind for business I have ever encountered, man or woman. Sir William is fortunate to have her. Without her, that estate would have been sold for parts a year ago." Davies spoke of her with an uncomplicated admiration that grated on the Duke for reasons he could not, or would not, name. This decent, respectful man saw Eleanora clearly. He was the foil against which Alaric's own blindness was thrown into sharp relief. The Duke began to arrange his rides so they would take him along the lanes bordering Ainsworth Park. One crisp autumn afternoon, he saw her. She was not in a carriage or on a docile mare, but on her feet, walking beside one of the drainage ditches with two of her uncle's farm hands. She was wearing sturdy boots caked with mud and a plain, dark cloak. Her head was bare, her dark hair pinned up simply. She was pointing at something in the ditch, and the two men were listening with rapt attention, nodding as she spoke. There was no deference in their posture, but no insolence either. It was the posture of men listening to an expert. She looked up and saw him on his great black stallion, a figure of immense and distant power. Their eyes met across the field. She gave him a brief, formal nod of acknowledgement, and then turned back to her work, dismissing him. Dismissing him. The Duke of Alverstone was not accustomed to being dismissed, especially not by a penniless spinster in muddy boots. And yet, he felt no anger. He felt a profound and unsettling jolt of respect. The woman he had pitied, the woman he had judged for her father's fecklessness, was the very architect of her family's salvation. She had not waited for a man to rescue her. She had rescued herself, and her entire household, with nothing but her own intelligence and will. His entire worldview, built on the solid bedrock of his father's failure, trembled. He had organized people into two categories, the competent and the incompetent, the predators and the prey. He had placed her firmly in the second category. He now saw that she belonged in the first, and that his system of judgment was a crude, flawed instrument. The knowledge sat uneasily within him. He found himself replaying their one dance, her quiet, surprising comment about the composer. He had dismissed it as a fluke, a rehearsed line. Now he saw it as a glimpse of the truth, a truth he had been too arrogant to see. He had looked at her and seen a gray dress and a sad story. He had failed to see the person at all. The thought was galling. It was a failure of perception, a failure of judgment, and for a man who prided himself on both, it was intolerable. Lady Beatrice, sensing a shift in his attentions, redoubled her efforts. She was more beautiful, more charming, more witty than ever. But the Duke found her company increasingly tiresome. Her world of glittering surfaces and social maneuverings seemed trivial compared to the quiet, tangible reality of what Eleanora Ainsworth was accomplishing. Lady Beatrice saw an estate as a backdrop for a party. Eleanora Ainsworth saw it as a living system to be nurtured and understood. One evening, at a dinner party, Lady Beatrice, noticing his distraction, leaned toward him. "You seem 1,000 miles away, Your Grace. Thinking of your new woodlands? I hear Sir William drove a hard bargain. Most surprising. One hears his niece has taken up accounting. How droll. I suppose a girl with no prospects must find a hobby." The barb, intended to amuse him and diminish Eleanora, had the opposite effect. It struck him as petty and mean-spirited. "Miss Ainsworth's hobby, as you call it, has saved her family from ruin," he said, his voice colder than he intended. "That is not droll. It is formidable." Lady Beatrice stared at him, her perfect smile faltering for a fraction of a second. She had made a misstep. She had underestimated the target, and in doing so, had revealed the smallness of her own spirit. The Duke looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a future duchess, but a beautiful, empty vessel. The perfect match was, he now realized, a perfect mismatch. The disquiet in his soul sharpened into a clear, painful certainty. He had been looking for the wrong things in entirely the wrong places. The crisis, when it came, was swift and brutal. It arrived in the form of a legal summons delivered to a stunned Sir William. The dismissed steward, Mr. Henderson, his pride wounded and his pockets empty, had found a new and venomous purpose. He had allied himself with a rival landowner, a man who had long coveted a certain water meadow on the Ainsworth estate. Together, they had concocted a charge of fraud against Sir William. Their weapon was Henderson's old, chaotic ledgers. In the hands of a clever, unscrupulous lawyer, the years of mismanagement, the phantom invoices, and the sloppy accounting were being twisted into a narrative of deliberate criminal deception. The timing was perfect. The accusation was linked to the recent sale of the woodland to the Duke, implying that Sir William had fraudulently misrepresented the health of his estate to secure a better price. The Duke, by extension, was named as a victim of this supposed fraud, his involvement lending the accusation a weight it would not otherwise have had. Sir William panicked. He was not a man built for crisis. His newfound confidence, which had always been a fragile thing borrowed from his niece, shattered completely. He saw debtor's prison looming, his name disgraced, his family homeless. "We are ruined," he stammered, waving the solicitor's letter at Eleanora. "This is your fault, your cleverness. You made me dismiss him, and now he has destroyed us." Eleanora took the letter from his trembling hand. She read it carefully, her face pale, but her expression calm. The accusation was a tissue of lies, but it was a cleverly constructed one. It preyed on her uncle's known history of financial difficulty and Henderson's reputation as a long-serving, if lazy, steward. To the outside world, it would seem plausible. Her uncle's accusation that this was her fault struck her more deeply than the legal threat. It was a cruel blow. She had worked for a year to save him, and at the first sign of trouble, he turned on her. But she did not have the luxury of feeling hurt. She folded the letter and placed it on the desk. "This is not the end, Uncle," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It is a lie, and we have the truth." "The truth," he scoffed. "Who will believe us? They have the Duke on their side. He will believe the worst of us.
He knows our name is synonymous with debt." He was right about that. The Duke of Alverstone, with his rigid principles and his personal history of ruin, would be predisposed to believe the worst. His father had been brought down by just such a man, a charismatic charlatan who used charm and confusing numbers to bleed him dry. To the Duke, this would look like history repeating itself. He would see her father's legacy in her, and her uncle's incompetence as a continuation of a familial pattern of fecklessness. They needed the Duke to believe them, and he was the one man in the world least likely to do so. Eleonora knew what she had to do. She could not hide behind her uncle any longer. She could not work from the shadows. She had to step into the light and face the Duke herself. It was a terrifying prospect. She would not be pleading for his mercy or his charity. She would be presenting him with evidence, demanding that he see the truth. She would be confronting the very man whose careless pity had set her on this path. And she would have to do it not as a woman, but as an expert. She spent the entire night in the estate office, not in a panic, but in careful, methodical preparation.
She gathered her own ledgers, the pristine, cross-referenced books that told the true story of the last year. She assembled the evidence of Henderson's incompetence, the letters from tenants, the revised supplier contracts, the land surveys. She was not preparing a defense. She was preparing a proof. The next morning she ordered the gig to be brought around. She dressed not in the gray pity dress, nor in her muddy workaday brown, but in a simple, dark blue traveling suit. It was the most authoritative garment she owned. It made her feel less like a niece and more like a solicitor. "Where are you going?" her uncle asked, his face haggard. "To see the Duke," she said. "He will not see you, and if he does, he will not listen." "Then I will make him listen," Eleonora replied. As she drove herself towards the grand, imposing gates of Alverstone House, her heart hammered against her ribs. She was not afraid of the legal threat. She was afraid of the man. She was afraid of those cold, gray eyes and the judgment she was sure she would find in them. She was about to present her mind and her work to the one person whose opinion, for reasons she could not untangle, mattered more than any other. She was asking to be seen, finally and completely, and she was terrified of what he would find. She did not ask to see the Duke. She informed the butler, a man of glacial composure, that she had urgent business with his master regarding the Ainsworth land purchase. She used the tone of a woman who expected to be obeyed, a tone she had perfected with difficult suppliers. It worked. She was shown not into a frivolous drawing room, but into the Duke's library, a vast, soaring space lined from floor to ceiling with books. It smelled of leather and beeswax and quiet, accumulated knowledge. It was the most beautiful room she had ever seen. The Duke was standing by the fireplace, one hand resting on the marble mantel. He turned as she was announced. His face was unreadable, a mask of aristocratic neutrality. But his eyes, she saw with a sinking heart, were as cold and distant as she remembered. Her uncle had been right. He had already judged them. "Miss Ainsworth," he said. His voice was flat. "This is an unexpected visit." "I apologize for the intrusion, Your Grace," she began, her own voice sounding small in the vast room. She clutched the portfolio of documents she had brought with her. "I have come about the legal matter raised by Mr. Henderson." "Ah, yes, the fraud," he said, the word dropping into the silence like a stone. "My solicitors are looking into it. They seem to think the case has merit." There it was.
the confirmation of her worst fears. He believed it. She felt a tremor go through her hands, and she tightened her grip on the portfolio. This was the moment. She could retreat, defeated, or she could fight. She thought of her year of silent work, of the cold nights in the estate office, of the quiet satisfaction of bringing order from chaos. She would not let a liar and a fool take that away from her. She straightened her shoulders and met his gaze directly. "The case has no merit, Your Grace. It is a fabrication built on old errors and malice. I have brought the proof." She walked to the great library table that dominated the center of the room and laid her portfolio upon it. She did not wait for his permission. She untied the ribbons and opened it, revealing her own pristine ledger. "This," she said, her voice gaining strength, "is the truth of Ainsworth Park's finances for the past year." He did not move from the fireplace. He watched her, his expression unchanged. "You expect me to credit your accounting over that of a man who served your uncle for 20 years. "I expect you to credit mathematics," she retorted, a spark of defiance flaring within her. "Mr. Henderson's ledgers are a work of fiction. These are a work of fact. Every entry is supported by a receipt, an invoice, or a tenant record, all of which are here." She gestured to the neat stacks of paper she had arranged beside the ledger. She had his attention now. He pushed himself away from the mantel and walked slowly towards the table. He stood opposite her, looking down at the open book. He did not touch it. He looked from the neat columns of figures to her face. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice quiet. "This is your uncle's affair." "My uncle is a good man, but he is not a man of business," she said simply. "I am. This is my work. The revitalization of the estate, the dismissal of Mr. Henderson, the negotiations for the woodland. It was all my work. The accusation of fraud is therefore an accusation against me, and I will not allow it to stand." He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on her ledger. The air in the room was thick with unspoken things: his prejudice, her pride, the memory of a dance. "My father," he said at last, his voice losing its cold edge and taking on a raw, personal note, "was ruined by a man who showed him books that looked very much like this. A man who charmed him with promises and blinded him with false figures. I learned from a young age to be suspicious of easy solutions and sudden reversals of fortune." It was a confession, a window into the wound that had shaped him. Eleonora felt her own defensiveness soften. He was not just a cold, arrogant duke. He was a man who had been deeply harmed, and who had built a fortress of principle to protect himself from being harmed again. "I am not your father's betrayer, Your Grace," she said, her voice gentle now. "I am not offering charm. I am offering evidence. Please, look at it." He finally reached out and touched the ledger, his long fingers tracing a line of her neat script. He began to turn the pages. Eleonora stood in silence, her heart pounding, as the most powerful man she knew audited the last year of her life. She did not speak. She let the numbers speak for her. She watched his face, looking for a sign, a flicker of understanding. For 10 minutes he read, his expression intent, focused. He picked up a sheaf of invoices and compared them to an entry in the book. He traced the lines of income and expenditure, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then he looked up, and his gray eyes were no longer cold. They were filled with a stunning, painful clarity. He was seeing her. For the very first time, he was seeing her. "It is all here," he said, his voice quiet with awe. "The entire story. It is perfect." "It is correct," she said, the distinction important to her. "Yes," he said, a slow smile touching his lips for the first time. It transformed his severe face, making him look younger, more human. "It is correct." He closed the ledger and looked at her, truly looked at her, across the polished expanse of the table. "I owe you an apology, Miss Ainsworth. I have misjudged you. Profoundly." The apology, offered so simply and without reservation, undid her in a way no accusation could have. She felt the rigid control she had maintained for a year begin to crumble. She gave a small, shaky nod, unable to speak. "The charges against your uncle will be dropped this afternoon," he said, his voice regaining its customary authority, but it was a different kind of authority now, not the authority of rank, but of conviction. "I will make it my personal business to see that Mr. Henderson and his associate regret their foolishness. Your family's name will be cleared." "Thank you, Your Grace," she managed to whisper. "No," he said, his voice softening again. "Thank you, Miss Ainsworth." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "You said the negotiation for the woodland was your work. I believe, then, that I have been paying my compliments to the wrong person. It was a brilliant piece of business." It was more than she had ever expected. It was acknowledgement. It was respect. It was vindication. She had come to the library seeking justice. She had found something far more valuable. She had been seen. The news of Henderson's failed legal challenge and the Duke's personal intervention swept through the county with astonishing speed. The story, however, was not one of ducal rescue. The narrative that took hold, fueled by the now unrestrained admiration of Mr. Davies, the solicitor, and the quiet gossip of tenants, was of Miss Ainsworth herself. She was no longer the poor relation. She was the heroine of the story. The quiet, overlooked girl who had single-handedly saved her family's fortune with her formidable mind. She had become, almost overnight, a local legend. Eleonora felt the shift in the very atmosphere around her. When she went into the village, people tipped their hats. Her aunt, bewildered by this turn of events, began to treat her with a new and nervous respect. Her uncle, humbled and grateful, ceded all pretense of control over the estate's finances, referring to her openly as his chancellor. A few weeks later, the autumn assembly was held in the market town. It was a smaller, more local affair than the Duke's grand ball, but for Eleonora, it felt like a far more significant test. She attended with her aunt and uncle, wearing not the gray pity dress, but a new gown of deep emerald green, a gift from her now adoring uncle. As she entered the assembly rooms, she felt the familiar pang of social anxiety. But this time, something was different. The whispers that followed her were not of pity, but of awe. Heads turned, not to dismiss her, but to get a better look at the famous Miss Ainsworth. For the first part of the evening, she remained seated, an old habit dying hard. But then Mr. Davies, the earnest solicitor, approached her, his face beaming with genuine admiration. "Miss Ainsworth, may I have the honor of this dance?" he asked, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. She accepted, and as he led her onto the floor, a murmur went through the room. It was not a dance of pity. It was a dance of respect. Mr. Davies did not make small talk about the weather. He asked her opinion on a new treatise on land enclosure, speaking to her as an intellectual equal. When the dance ended, another man was waiting. He was a local squire, a bluff, hearty landowner who had been struggling with his own estate's accounts. "Miss Ainsworth," he boomed. "My turn, I think. A man told me you can make a field of stones sprout gold. I must learn your secret." And so it began. For the first time in her life, Eleonora had a full dance card. Lord after lord, squire after squire, the men of the county lined up to partner her. They were not drawn by her beauty or her dowry, but by her competence. They saw her not as a prospective bride, but as a marvel, a phenomenon. They wanted to be near her intelligence. By midnight, every eligible and ineligible man in the room had either danced with her or sought an introduction. She had become the most sought-after woman at the ball, not for her hand in marriage, but for the contents of her head. Across the room, the Duke of Alverston watched. He had come to the assembly for the sole purpose of seeing her, a fact he had not yet admitted even to himself. He stood by a pillar, a dark, unmoving figure, and observed her quiet triumph. He saw the respect in the eyes of her partners. He saw the new confidence in her posture, the small, rare smile that touched her lips as she debated crop yields with a grizzled old farmer. He saw what he had been blind to. He saw what he had almost lost through his own arrogant pride. The woman he had dismissed was the most extraordinary person in the room, and every other man could now see it too. A feeling he had not experienced since his youth, a sharp, unfamiliar pang of jealousy, shot through him. It was followed by an even more terrifying emotion: fear. Fear that he was too late. He watched as Mr. Davies led her from the dance floor, his expression full of open adoration.
He could not bear it. He pushed himself away from the pillar and began to walk across the floor. Once again, the crowd parted for him. All conversation ceased. The music seemed to falter. Every eye in the room was on him as he approached the woman in the emerald green dress. Eleonora saw him coming. Her heart gave a violent lurch. He stopped before her, his face serious, his gray eyes intense. Mr. Davies, sensing the shift in gravity, gave a small bow and melted back into the crowd. "Miss Ainsworth," the Duke said, his voice low and resonant, meant for her alone. "Your Grace," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. He did not ask if her dance card was full. He did not ask if she was enjoying the evening. He looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. "I have come to ask you to dance," he said. It was not a command, not an act of charity. It was a raw, vulnerable request. The orchestra, as if on cue, began to play a waltz. The same waltz as that night, a year ago. She placed her hand in his. This time his grip was not impersonal. It was warm, firm, possessive. He led her to the center of the floor. He put his hand on her waist, and this time there was no calculated distance. He drew her close, into the circle of his world. They began to dance. They moved as one, perfectly in step. He did not look over her head. His eyes never left her face. "They are all looking at you," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her ear. "They are looking at you, Your Grace," she corrected softly. "No," he said, "they are looking at you. And for the first time they are seeing you, as I am. Forgive me for being so late to the truth." She did not know what to say. The entire world had shrunk to the space between them. to the pressure of his hand on her back, to the intensity of his gaze. All the lonely nights, all the painstaking work, all the quiet endurance, it had all led to this moment, to this dance that was the polar opposite of the first. That had been a humiliation. This was a coronation. "Eleonora," he said, using her given name for the first time. It sounded like a prayer on his lips. "I find my estates are in a dreadful state of order. My ledgers are balanced, my accounts are reconciled. It is all terribly, terribly dull." A small smile touched her lips. "I am sorry to hear it, Your Grace." "It is a disaster," he continued, his own eyes smiling down at her. "I find I have no need for a financial mind, which is a great pity, because I had hoped to offer one a permanent position." Her heart stopped. She stared up at him, searching his face. There was no artifice there, only a deep and profound sincerity. "My title is old," he said quietly. "My houses are vast, and my responsibilities are endless. It is a partnership I am seeking, Eleonora, not just a duchess. I need someone who understands the difference between a balance sheet and a life. Someone who knows the value of things. I need you." It was the most beautiful proposal she could have ever imagined. He was not offering her a crown. He was offering her a seat at the table, a key to the estate office, a partnership in the business of life. He was acknowledging and valuing the very competence that society had taught her to hide. The music swelled around them, but they were the still center of the turning world. She looked up into the eyes of the Duke of Alverstone, the cold man who carried a wound, and saw that his fortress had fallen. And she knew that her own, so carefully constructed, had as well. "Your Grace," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I believe I should like to examine your books." 5 years later, the Duchess of Alverstone sat in the great library of Alverstone House, a room she now knew as well as her own mind. Sunlight streamed through the tall Palladian windows, illuminating the motes of dust dancing in the air and casting a warm glow on the rows of leather-bound books. The scent of beeswax and old paper was now the scent of home. Across the massive table from her, her husband, the Duke, was bent over a map of the North Holdings, his brow furrowed in the same intense concentration she had seen that first day in this very room. A ledger, one of hers, lay open between them, its neat columns a testament to their shared governance. The duchy had never been more prosperous, but it was a different kind of prosperity now. Under Eleonora's guidance, it was a prosperity that flowed downwards, nourishing the land and the people who worked it. They had built schools, repaired cottages, and invested in new agricultural methods that provided security for their tenants. She had taken the Duke's rigid principles and infused them with her own deep-seated pragmatism and compassion. He, in turn, had given her a platform from which her intelligence could reshape a small corner of the world. Theirs was not a romance of whispered sweet nothings and grand public gestures. It was a romance of shared purpose, of mutual respect, of heads bent together over maps and ledgers in the quiet light of a library. A small sound from the hearth drew her attention. Their son, 3-year-old Thomas, who had his father's serious gray eyes and his mother's determined chin, was carefully stacking wooden blocks into a teetering tower. He was humming to himself, a tuneless, contented little song. Eleonora smiled. She looked from her son to her husband. Alaric looked up at that moment, as if feeling her gaze, and his severe face softened with the smile that was still hers alone. He reached across the table and laid his hand over hers, his fingers lacing with her own on top of the open ledger. It was a simple, familiar gesture,
an anchor in their quiet, well-ordered world. He had not just given her a title. He had given her a home for her mind. He had seen the woman she was and had decided she was not just worth a dance, but worth everything. The memory of the girl in the gray dress, standing invisible behind a potted palm, felt like a story from another life, a sad, forgotten prologue to the real text. The ballroom had been a place of judgment, but the library had become a place of grace. Here, surrounded by books and maps, with her husband's hand covering hers and her son playing by the fire, Eleanora Ainsworth, the girl no one saw, had finally and completely found her place. She had not been rescued. She had been recognized. And she had discovered that love was not about being saved from ruin, but about finding the one person willing to help you build a better world. One correct entry at a time.